So, what I'm going to be talking to you about is our digital twin journey at TUS. Now, it's not a typical digital twin journey, so I'll start there. It wasn't just me, although I'm speaking here today. There was also two other key individuals, Jonathan Blackmore and Shane Barron. Now, this is what we set out to do. We set out to create a digital twin of an existing building without using anything else. All right, now any of you who have ever seen digital twin, and indeed the example given earlier talked about sensor measurements and all that kind of stuff. And if we're going from a point of known design in a BIM system all the way out to a digital twin, it's a much more palatable proposition. This is a horror show. And that's where we decided we'd have a crack at. The objective, of course, was obviously to do that and to create a digital asset that can be used by staff and by students for teaching and learning. Ultimately, not just the final asset, but also the individual component parts along the way, including things like the point cloud. We wanted to warehouse it in an accessible platform that people could get to. As it turned out, that was ACC. And, of course, provide for expansion, improvement, and updating. And a core part of the vision on this is to have this digital twin in position, at a certain level now, which is not great, but to allow students themselves to start developing and improving and using the model, so it becomes a live teaching tool, which people can use. Now, so the approach we took was drone-based LiDAR and ground-based LiDAR. We trialed a number of different platforms in the course of this. I'm not going to mention names, but you can probably see from what they are anyway. We found the drone extraordinary. It was an amazing piece of kit. We basically pointed it at a wall and off it would go and it would just fly the surface for us. There was a few downsides to that. It was typically flight time, but that's not going to be unusual. Ground-based LiDAR systems as well, we started looking at those and using those for data capture. We also, when it came to this reality capture, the initial processing is usually going to be on proprietary software. So whatever your scanner is, that manufacturer is going to have something that will talk directly to that. Unfortunately, we found that in most cases, that's an additional package. So you buy the equipment, and then, by the way, you got to buy the software. I think that could be a little bit harsh. I think a few vendors would want to look at that particular philosophy. Now, the other thing we did was we went for the highest resolution capture we could take. Now, that did add to scan time, it added to processing time and everything else, but it's easier to downgrade further on in your work processes. But once you've got a high quality, the best you can get type of scan, then you've got choices. But if you capture in low resolution, then you can't improve upon that. It's simple as. The other thing we've seen out there is a number of vendors selling registrationless or targetless scanning. So basically you drop in from point to point and the device is going to pick up its location. What we found was that failed in a lot of instances. It didn't work so great. So we're saying targets are absolutely necessary. And particularly if you're using this through a build process, you're going to want to have those established as you're going through. Large data sets coming off the other end, typically greater than 100 gig. Now that doesn't sound like a whole heap, but you try moving that around on things like a 5G connection or Ethernet or whatever else, it slows things down. So it was tricky enough from that regard. Now the point cloud processing itself, what we found, again, we used a number of different vendors as we were going through this. The initial stage is processor intensive. So when you're taking the raw data off of the capture device and processing that, it is very, very processor intensive. Little graphic there is just showing what some of the horrors that my poor old machine had to go through. I was crunching this on an i7 with 96 gig of RAM and a couple terabytes of SSD. And for one particular data set, it took over 40 hours of processing. Just to put that in context, I can assure you when you're looking at that, you're thinking, will I just hit the cancel button? Will I just, 40 hours later it came out. Later stages are graphics intensive. So once you get that initial cloud there, the final kind of cleanups are very, very heavy on your graphics card on the machine. High res is obviously going to slow down processing. Now, because you're capturing, or at least the approach we took as capturing in high res, it meant that when we started to produce artifacts for use by other individuals, we could lower the resolution and make them a lot more transportable. We had that choice, but we can always go back into it. Exports can be done lower res. 25 mil point to point is typically okay for modeling. We've gone as far as 50 mil and it worked out fine. Typical formats, RCP, E57 and other proprietary formats would be used there. Now the next stage in our process was to get into the modeling, and again there's a number of tools out there that we explored and tried, and they had varying degrees of functionality from fair to middling to downright awful. So in the end we wound up processing this stuff manually. So we bring in the point cloud and we start modeling against that. It was not as difficult as you might think, because what they do provide, most vendors are providing some really excellent tools for that process. So if we look on the top there, you can see that I can see a point cloud there in one of the tools. I can see that, and I can see it reflected directly into Revit itself. So as I move my camera view within any of those tools, it's automatically reflected in the other. So when it comes to picking up that data, it's absolutely excellent at that. And you can see things in there a lot clearer. The typical manual approach is to start taking slices through the point clouds in order to put in, figure out walls and doors and stuff like that. You lose a lot of information, so having that view is excellent. The 360 images were also really invaluable here. You do have an option on most scan tools not to get the 360s. It takes a bit of time to produce those on the scanner. So some people will opt not to use them. We opted to use them. And we found them absolutely invaluable. Not only did it allow us on the model to keep going on the modeling side, but it also provided a record at that point in time. So we have a contemporaneous record of the building as it existed at that point in time in a fairly high-res format as well. 50 mil resolution. I previously mentioned 25. We have gone as far as 50 mil resolution, and that worked for modeling. And again, it's going to be processor and graphics intensive. Now, the next thing we had to try and figure out was data warehousing. How are we going to get this stuff out there so people can start using it? The size of the data sets obviously present a problem in storage and distribution. Storage, not so much. Distribution, definitely. You can put it on a cloud service very easily, but it doesn't mean people are going to be able to download that. And a lot of these formats are single file 100 gig. That being the case, if you have a failure, you can have a failure at 95% download and you're back to scratch. In an ideal world it'd always fail at 5%, but it never seems to go that way. So that tends to cause some issues. High-speed USB combined with SSD worked okay. We found that could be a little bit slow. You definitely needed USB 2, I think it is, and 3. And that seemed to work all right. Just an SSD drive worked fine for that. The other thing we've also kind of been using is ACC, so Autodesk Construction Cloud. That is supporting point clouds natively now. So that's a real joy. There are some limits there on general file size, which will obviously apply. So I think there's a 48 gig limit on any file, and processed, which means you can see it in a viewer, is going to be less than 20. And we have used that, and we found that really excellent. Again, when you start dropping the resolution of the cloud, you can start going in and have a look at it that way. The other thing we did during the modeling process is we used ACC as a platform on that. Standard work sharing, many of you are familiar with it. So off it went up to the cloud, and that allowed us to track the creation of the model and to see how we were progressing it, and of course to report to other people on how that model was progressing. So where are we from point cloud to actual model? It worked fairly well. The point cloud obviously was housed up in ACC as well, and we could link that directly into the model as well. So we had a single source of truth for both the model and the point cloud that we were using to create that. So that worked out a treat. So we used to use the tracking functionality within ACC. It did lead to a lot of published items. We got up to version 16, 17 fairly quickly. But you know what? It's a small price to pay. When you think how useful it is, it's something. And again, as I said, I'd be quick. Lessons learned for us in particular on this one. Scan to BIM is still primarily a manual process. All right, it's the automation is just not there yet. Now, I'll be having this conversation, I have no doubt, in about 5 years' time, and I'm going to say that it just happens and it just works. We have seen the development, even in the course of this project, which ran for maybe 4 months, we saw product releases occurring and improvements being made. So the advances here are rapid and frequent. Your fieldwork and the processes you use within fieldwork are absolutely vital as well. You need to have a scanning plan, a rough idea of what it is you're going to do. You don't just grab a scanner and head out there. Have a very well thought out plan in place. It won't take you long to create that, but you should have one. That would include things like your targets, and each target having a unique identifier. So when you do come to process this stuff, the AI behind it can find stuff an awful lot easier. Also, making sure that you capture all various areas and silly things like access to areas of the building you wouldn't normally go to. Security is something you need to think about there as well. You don't want to scan everything. You don't want to give away information unnecessarily. Next one, high-spec computers. You need that. This is the bugbear of a lot of people over a lot of different times. It's like, oh, do you really need a powerful computer? The answer is yes. If you're going to be pushing around this kind of data, then you absolutely need to have that. I would argue, no, when I say high-spec computer, I'm not talking supercomputers here. I'm talking dropping $5,000 on something. Now, NVIDIA graphics cards tend to be a requirement. So, 40 generation NVIDIA graphics card combined with an i9 and at least 64 gig of memory, and you're in a pretty solid position to keep going. As I said there, the automated tools do need to be improved, but they're on the way. The 360 images, as I've said, these were so useful to us. We found that they captured so much data, and they also allowed others to get a better sense of what we were up to, because the clouds don't always do it. And the final part then is, I suppose, the access to those finished models does need to be controlled. We do need to be mindful of security when we're doing this, and the amount of data contained within a digital twin is phenomenal. And that information can be useful, and it can be used against you if you're not careful. So, all of that does need to be controlled. For us, our next step, we're going to obviously get the model to a better place. We're kind of at that 80% mark, so we've done the easy stuff. The next thing for us is to start looking at the services, and because we have our high-res images combined with the 360 imagery, we can start making that jump an awful lot easier. So we can start putting in things like smoke detectors, panel locations, and all that kind of stuff. It's going to be difficult, and the big challenge for us will be to try and make a useful model of the stuff that exists behind the things that get scanned. So what's in the interstitial spaces and all of that stuff. But it's been an interesting journey for us, and we've certainly learned a lot along the way. So, that is it for me.